realistically, as a merchant, right, your number one goal is to connect to consumers at the time that they're trying to think through that buying decision. Historically, that has meant, returning them to your own surface. And so the real question becomes, if everything is going to be seamlessly architected through a single surface or a multitude of surfaces, but nevertheless, the experience will be seamless, how do you ensure discoverability?
Welcome back, everyone. We are very excited for our guest today at This Week in FinTech's podcast. This is Nick Milanovic, and I'm co-hosting here with Jillian Williams, the general partner of Field Ventures and a longtime FinTech investor. And we are sitting at Money 2020, 2025, across the table from Michelle Gill, who is the general manager of small business financial services at PayPal. Michelle is also a longtime FinTech veteran, and I will not give away her whole bio, but her accolades include being SoFi's chief financial officer, an early role as a managing director at Goldman, the general manager and executive vice president of consumer lending and capital markets at SoFi, and the manager of QuickBooks Money's platform at Intuit. Michelle, I know you're extremely busy. Really appreciate you making the time here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I would love it if you could just kind of expand on your background a little bit and tell us about your journey so that people who are listening to the podcast know how you ended up here.
Yeah, sure. So currently at PayPal, I'm running the small business part of the business as well as financial services. That means financial services both for consumers as well as merchants. And I've recently taken on the role of running our Agentic commerce agenda as well, which, as you can imagine, has been a hot topic here at Money 2020 this week. In terms of how I got here, I wouldn't say it was the straightest path. I started my career as a lawyer. Transitioned into finance pretty early, having never opened Excel. So for anyone out there who is wondering, can
possible.
You do it? You can. And ultimately spent a lot of time at Goldman, mostly on the structured finance side. And during the crisis, helped a lot of banks restructure. In that structured finance arm, as FinTech was starting, it was really their entry point into the firm, because a lot of businesses had a balance sheet component to the business that they really weren't expecting to need help with. And so I got to know a lot of FinTech founders pretty early. My husband decided to found a FinTech in California. That was the impetus for our move. And then once you're in California, it's pretty hard to not want to take that leap and become part of FinTech. And so getting to work with Anthony at SoFi was one of the most rewarding experiences, having, sort of followed on to what Mike and Nino were building and ultimately taking the company public, first in the CFO role and ultimately in a GM role. And then getting to meet Alex and making the decision to really, go to Intuit, really build out the money platform there was also pretty incredible. I obviously met Alex there, and then the opportunity to continue to work in small business has been incredibly rewarding.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. I think you mentioned at the beginning that obviously agentic commerce, agentic payments is really kind of the main topic today at Money 2020 and just the last 12 months in the FinTech land. And so I'm curious in terms of maybe stepping back a little bit of how fundamentally different do you think this shift is in the commerce landscape versus previous ones?
Yeah. So when I look at, where consumers are going to be starting their shopping journey, our expectation is that over 40% of consumers are going to move the beginning of their shopping journey and discovery into chat surfaces. And why does that matter? Well, realistically, as a merchant, right, your number one goal is to connect to consumers at the time that they're trying to think through that buying decision. Historically, that has meant, returning them to your own surface. And so the real question becomes, if everything is going to be seamlessly architected through a single surface or a multitude of surfaces, but nevertheless, the experience will be seamless, how do you ensure discoverability? it's a completely different paradigm than what we've become accustomed to. So if you think about the shift initially from in-store retail to online, PayPal played a huge role, right, in that journey, because you needed a trust marker when you were entering your credit card details online. Now we're moving to, wait, I'm going to go from online to potentially an agent to agent protocol where I may not even be present for that transaction. And I need to have some trust that that is going to happen in the way that I want it to, and that there's not going to be spending out of control because I'm not available, that the right thing will get purchased, that if the right thing doesn't get purchased, I have a mechanism for returning it. And so a lot of the sort of early issues associated with buying on the internet are going to see a resurgence as people are trying to understand what are the protocols behind, how this is all going to, manifest itself. So I think it'll be a pretty meaningful shift in terms of timing and, how long it takes and how seamless are the experiences really, and what's the availability of product, right? That may take longer. But I think consumer expectations have continued to be that you can get anything, anywhere, anytime, in a short amount of time. And so that seamlessness is something that I think a lot of these agentic services can bring to bear in a whole new way. And I think discoverability is going to end up being really paramount.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, there's that demand from consumers that they want to be able to find anything as easy as possible. But I think maybe from your perspective, from the small business side and the merchant side, how do those kind of differ in alignment as we move into this agentic commerce space?
Yeah, so consumers are going to want convenience above all else, right? And the ability to get everything done seamlessly and in one place, right? So where you used to search 7 different websites for that thing that you were looking for, the notion of having one surface wherein you can compare and contrast cross product, cross, retailers is pretty interesting. Now, what's really important for a merchant is the notion that when that consumer is searching, you are actually going to be available. And so when I think about the historical search that you've done, right, it's been, you think of the top bar on the retailer site, right? It's typically size, color, right? Whatever the parameters are. Now think of an unparameterized world where the description is really going to be really paramount. So instead of that black backpack, I want a black backpack that can carry 2 side water bottles, that weighs less than a pound, that has 4 pockets, right? Like that's not a search that you can do today and yield a relatively interesting result. And so it'll be really interesting to just see how descriptive, some of these items become, how different the catalog is, right, relative to what we've seen historically. And does it need to be parameterized, right? How can the data be ingested? So I do think we'll see a shift. And I think there'll be all sorts of discoverability questions that come with that.
How much help do you think the merchants need with that? Because some of them have the most basic website setups where even searching the SKUs is almost impossible, versus some might be a little bit more complex. But I guess what tools do they need?
I think the question's sort of 2-part. The biggest issue that we see for merchants today is how much time do I allocate to this AI thing? I need to future-proof my business, but I also need to run the present. And the challenge is no one is really clear on when this is all going to happen. If you set yourself up and architect yourself for the early innings, is that going to be where things end up, or is that time wasted? And so one of the things that we're excited about bringing to bear is we're going to adopt all the protocols. We're going to have open architecture. We're going to make it such that a merchant can integrate once and propagate multiple times, because we think that's really important. Merchants don't have the time to future-proof their business and try to pick a winner right now. And they need the opportunity to know that if there's going to be specialized LLMs, right, they'll be able to access those. And so I think that's one part of the help, is just infrastructure-wise, how do I ensure that I am actually adopting the right infrastructure and have the right protocols, et cetera. Then I think there's the second question of, okay, in terms of do I need different images than I've historically had? And does the quality of my images need to change, right, to be able to capture some of the nuance that it didn't have to capture historically? Do I need a different description? How important is my web store? Is my web store something that legitimizes me, or is there a different trust marker that legitimizes me? And that's when we get excited again about the resurgence of PayPal's trust marker, right? Like that's really important. A consumer knows that when they're paying, they have the ability to know that they're going to get fraud protection. Right? Like all of these things. But to your question, like there's a lot that merchants have to think through, and we're trying to make it easy because, right now they're right in the middle of holiday shopping season and prepping for that. And they've got plenty of other things that they're worried about. Earlier this year, it was tariffs, right? So they have had, a litany of things to have to worry about. And this one isn't small.
Small business owners aren't exactly characterized by having too much free time to think about things.
Precisely.
I'm glad that you brought up the transition from retail to e-commerce because, if you're kind of a student of internet history, what we're really talking about here is this big re-architecting of how the online and internet experience works. And, I'm glad, Jillian's honing in on the merchant experience because in agentic commerce as a topic, you spend so much time thinking through what the consumer experience and opportunities are going to be. But, on the supply side, it seems like that experience hasn't really been thought out. And what I'm wondering for is, your perspective on how merchants are able to really defend and grow their brand and franchise value in a world of agentic search first, e-commerce shopping, where, to kind of paint the picture, the consensus bet seems to be that people will primarily do their shopping at some point for goods and services through an agentic interface where basically you are pulling in data and information from around the internet and you have a very simple compare contrast along the parameters that you just described for a backpack, for instance. And so you're in some sense commoditizing the end product a little bit here, and you are taking away, web viewership from merchant websites entirely. And so, really investing in your website may not be a great brand or franchise defense strategy. Apart from that, you're also making the primary shopper effectively the agent. And so similarly to when, Google started growing in dominance, you had search engine marketing and search engine optimization to make sure that you were following in results. Similarly here as a merchant, you have to think about how do I make sure that I am showing up in the results with my product and that this kind of commoditization of the shopping experience doesn't ultimately erode all the effort that I put into developing a brand relationship with the customer. So if you're a merchant, how do you think about that?
So I think there's so much to unpack there.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I love the question. So the first thing is, right, let me not address the agent to agent part first. Let me address the human in the loop for a minute, and then we'll move to agent, and then types of purchases that might happen through agents and types that might not, right? Because I'm not sure that you get very excited about redoing your grocery list every week and having to do the substitutions when the things that you don't want or that you want are not on that list. That may be something that you're perfectly happy to have someone suggest to you and really reduce the amount of time that you spend on it. At the same time, when you're picking out, that anniversary gift for your wife, or partner, that may be something that you actually want, something unique. And that is a very different, human in the loop type experience relative to agent. And so I think what we're going to find is the things that are time consuming without value add, without meaningful value add, you will be very happy to outsource to an agent. As an example, your back to school, notebook shopping, your back to school clothes shopping, you may feel very differently about. And again, I think the thing that's become really interesting watching my kids who are 13 and 16 and the power of suggestion that they get, right? The preponderance of that power of suggestion is coming through experiential, videos that they are watching that are telling them, oh, you should like this makeup or you should like this, and so I do wonder if we're actually just going to see a bifurcation of experiences wherein a certain type of set of experiences, you're 100% great having an agent take over and have it be agent to agent. Another set of experiences where you're looking for something unique or you want the power of suggestion and something that you actually get pleasure out of, you're going to actually have more time to spend on. And so going back to when I was little and my dad and I were having this argument about the ATM. And I said, the ATM is going to be awful. Like, I'll never speak to the teller again. And he said, like, well, think about like if all of that time that you spent talking to that teller, standing in line at the bank, you could spend with your grandmother on the phone. Like, wouldn't you rather repurpose that time? So I think it's, again, there are parts of the experience that we would all be thrilled to have incredibly commoditized. And there are parts of the experience that we actually get pleasure out of, and that selection. And the thing that I get really excited about, actually, you said something about, does it make sense to still have a website? So I think about, I'm doing my back to school shopping. I want a really fun sweatshirt, right? I'm going to be able to put in criteria that says, these are the types of sweatshirts I love. Can you find me, similar type sweatshirts that are brand new brands that haven't been seen before, are barely worn, or whatever the case may be. So then all of a sudden you get that surfaced. I pick that particular one from an aftermarket experience, right? That merchant can then bring me back to their site and say, hey, by the way, like, you liked this. There's a whole bunch of other sweatshirts that look quite similar. So I'm not sure exactly how all of this is going to play out. Like, does that merchant resurface things through the chat? Does it resurface things through its own surface? Is all of that interaction just done through our phone? I think there's a lot yet to be played out, and it's hard to imagine that any of these things goes away, which is why I think it's even harder for merchants, because they still have to invest in their website. They have to invest in this new service. They have to invest in these new experiences, and they don't know what use case is going to move toward what yet. And so I think we're all sort of anticipating. And I also think the pace of change will be slower than we think to start, and faster than we think on the adoption side once it sort of starts.
It's interesting because something I constantly think about is like, I have friends who love shopping, like love online shopping, and part of just that browsing experience and window shopping, but online, is really what they're excited about. And I think from the merchant standpoint, that also leads to a lot of upsell. Like, it could be clothing, or honestly, like you brought up the grocery example. Like, I use Instacart for a lot of my groceries. I'm lazy that way, but like, I honestly end up like clicking the things that they're suggesting for me, even though I'm usually getting 90% the same thing. And then I'll be like, oh, this is a fun new treat. Let me add that to my cart as well. And so do you think that gets lost? And especially for the merchants, the ability to upsell random products or just make the cart a lot bigger because someone came across something that they didn't necessarily have the intent to buy, but then saw and liked?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And when I think about your Instacart example or any grocery example, the way I picture it, and who knows how this will evolve, is you put in your grocery list. There's a bunch of things on there that are not that interesting. Your toilet paper rebuy, you don't actually care. However, there are things that could be interesting, like, and does it basically say, okay, your order's complete. Here are 3 items that we would suggest you substitute out. Actually, we have a new brand of toilet paper. Or actually, we have a new vegetable that's in season right now. And literally, it just surfaces on your phone right as you're about to pay. You can skip or you can look. And some days you're just too busy and you're going to skip. Some days, but to your question, like, does it reduce or increase upsell? Well, arguably, when you're doing your Instacart order, like, there's a certain amount of time that you're dedicating that is not great time. There's now all of a sudden you actually have the time to spend on the things that might be interesting. And then, as you're interested, it can continue to prompt you if it gauges that you actually have and are spending time on this, rather than, today it's necessarily the case that it takes a certain amount of time. So I think it's a little hard to know as to exactly how all of that manifests. I do think the post-purchase experience is going to become richer and richer. And, the notion of a lot of that suggestion being, within the first few minutes that you order, or at the time that you're about to click yes, saying, would you like to add this onto your order, and tack it on because, it's not going to be delivered for 2 hours, et cetera.
The other aspect I think about a lot, and Nick kind of touched upon this a little bit, is that loyalty piece. And I think I've seen so many brands actually investing deeper into loyalty over the past few years. And I think like any website you go onto, there's like some discount for you to give them your email and number. And so how does that change? And just, do they no longer care about that loyalty and rewards piece? Or I guess, how does that look in an agentic world?
Yeah, I think the notion of what's the merchant consumer relationship in an agentic world is really critical, right? And we've gotten really excited about that because we think about ways in which we can embed that loyalty and rewards into the wallet, and also be in a position to, whether through Honey or other properties, actually allow for merchant funded offers and other ways in which you can continue to evoke that reward and loyalty. We do think it's really critical. And, I keep focusing on aftermarket experience because I think that's what takes the consumer back to the merchant. And again, you may not purchase on the merchant surface because you may still want to do the compare relative to something else on one of these other surfaces. But at the same time, it's that relationship that becomes really critical to continue to cement, and make sure that there is that loyalty. And so reinforcing, at the checkout, congratulations, you were able to use, this many of your points, right? Because you also don't want all of that to get lost in the ecosystem, and you want to continue to build it. I arguably think it matters more in the future when people are not returning to the site, because it really, to your point, it creates that loyalty and that reminder. So one of the things that becomes really interesting is if you have a recognized user on that surface, right, and we have the wallet, and you can conjoin those two, how do you actually tell the consumer, here's a choice that will dovetail with what loyalty and reward points you have in your wallet, right? So again, you actually use that to personalize the selection that really gets put forth in front of the consumer.
I hope so. I am an alumnus of trying and failing to build good merchant funded offers and rewards as an experience. I feel like this is the white whale of consumer fintech. We tried at Petal when we were building a credit card to create a good merchant funded offers program, could not do it. We tried at Google Pay to add it into the wallet, could not do it. And it felt like the issue was that the lack of time and incentive on the consumer side drove a very low take rate on merchant funded offers. And so that also feels like a massive opportunity for artificial intelligence, where you can become aware of consumer tastes and preferences. When I was at Google Pay, I promise I'm getting to a question here. I'm sorry. I also was working with PayPal as our relationship manager there, and they stressed to us that PayPal is not a payments company; it's an e-commerce company, and payments is a part of that portfolio. And I think that really became clear when PayPal acquired Honey, which, among other things, gave the company a lot more perspective into the pre-purchase experience, not just the post-purchase experience. And so I'm curious, how do you think about merchant-funded offers in a world where you really do have agentic services that understand consumer tastes and preferences, and in developing a relationship with that consumer much, much earlier before the actual purchase happens, where your PayPal is able to leverage this trusted relationship in order to act as a guide towards an ultimate purchase decision?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think when you look at the power of the data that PayPal has from the years of history with that consumer, and the notion of bringing that to bear to personalize experiences, and then you attach the merchant funded offers to it, the nice thing is, can you actually surface at the time of purchase, right, this notion of, hey, here's a merchant funded offer. So, you're in a service, you have 4 things that you're selecting from, and out pops a merchant funded offer for one of them. And again, that may not appear for Jillian, but it may appear for me because I've never purchased before, or what Jillian sees is actually different from what I see, because they know that if Jillian is given, a discount, she may buy a second pair of shoes, right? Versus if I'm given a discount, it may be the first time customer discount, right? Because they're really trying to get me to, come back in some way. And so that's the thing we get excited about. But to your point, there has to be a lot of identification data that is, really brought to bear to facilitate that experience. Absent that, you're getting a pretty generic experience.
How much of that identification data do you think will pass between whatever the chat platform is and PayPal or the shops? Because I think about it where, like, at this point, OpenAI, Perplexity know a lot about me, just given when I ask them questions. And so I'm sure there's a lot of identifying information in there where it's like, I'm a Starbucks drinker, but I don't drink coffee, I drink tea. Starbucks doesn't seem to know that, but they would know that. And so I feel like it would be beneficial for the brands to be able to actually understand some of that relationship. But obviously there's also data sharing challenges as well.
I think you're pointing to one of the most negotiated items that's going to exist in this new architecture and ecosystem, which is just who owns what data, and what information can and cannot be used to personalize, and the permissioning around people's data, and wanting to make sure that the experience is delightful without being creepy. And I think that line, I mean, we're all smiling because we've all gone through the experience of like, I don't love that person knows that about me.
I think my
and
phone's
at the
listening to
same
me.
time, we've also gone through the experience of like, that was incredible. I can't believe everyone doesn't do this, right? And that difference, right, and that line has moved pretty meaningfully. I think if you looked at where all of us were 10 years ago and what we would be willing to accept as delightful versus creepy, was probably pretty meaningfully away from where we are today.
On one of the other points you mentioned around trust, I think that's a really interesting dynamic in the space, because I think you can think about it from different layers. Obviously, there's fraud, but then also, like, if I give my agent a budget of $100 and somehow it took that as $1,000, like, it's kind of like, where does the blame fall, and like, where do repercussions, and how do we actually monitor everything, just given there's even another layer now added into the stack?
Yeah, I think there's a couple questions in there, right? How much permissioning are you going to give the agent? How much is the agent infrastructure actually willing to take? Like, you may be willing to give permission of X, but the agent architecture is not ready to accept that yet. And what does permissioning mean? Does it mean never having a human in the loop, or does it mean going and executing up until the last step and then ensuring that, hey, by the way, like, I still want to make sure that you want to do this. And then there's, if I had to guess, right, it's going to be different based on individual. Like, you're going to actually enumerate your preference for being in the loop or not being in the loop with that agent. There's agents that will ostensibly gain more of your trust over time. But right now it feels like that's pretty far away. And, you know, there are agent to agent tasks that you can see being undertaken. Probably, you know, every time you talk to someone about commerce and the use of their wallet, there seems to be this like, whoa, like, I'll let it do a lot. I'm not going to let it do that. And so I think people are pretty guarded when they come to their money. And I think, you know, seeing those use cases, that being said, I think to, you know, that item that you really wanted that just had a price drop, you know, you may say execute that immediately, right? And so it'll be interesting, I think, to see the use cases and how much trust is embedded. I also think that's where, like, we've been really focused on the legitimacy of the merchant. So you ask, like, it's not that hard to go create a website, put a bunch of items on it, and never ship. Right. And so how do you guard against that? Because it is so easy today. And how do you ensure that you actually have some protection in place to know that when you're buying, it's going to get shipped, that someone has legitimized that, et cetera. And that's where, like, we do feel like the relationships that we've built on the merchant side and the ability to really